Sarah had never been one to shy away from a little adventure. The idea of spending the weekend in a remote cabin, deep within the woods, sounded like the perfect escape from the hustle and bustle of city life. Her friends had been skeptical at first, but as the days passed and they drove further into the wilderness, they became more and more excited by the beauty of the untouched nature around them. The cabin was small but cozy, nestled at the foot of towering trees whose branches seemed to stretch endlessly into the sky. They spent the first few hours hiking, enjoying the crisp, cool air and the peaceful solitude that only the forest could offer. The only sounds that filled the air were the soft rustle of leaves, the occasional bird call, and their own laughter as they explored. But as night began to fall, a strange unease settled over Sarah. The forest, which had felt so welcoming in the daylight, now seemed oppressive, as if the trees were closing in around them. The distant chirping of crickets grew louder, but everything else fell silent, as though the entire forest was holding its breath. After a hearty dinner, Sarah's friends settled around the cabin, chatting and sipping wine, but Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She excused herself and ventured outside, feeling the chill of the evening air prickling her skin. The forest looked entirely different in the darkness, its shadows deep and foreboding. Her mind told her to stay close to the cabin, but the woods beckoned her, calling her further. She decided to follow the trail that wound through the trees, just to clear her mind. The sound of her footsteps was the only thing breaking the heavy silence as she walked deeper into the wilderness. It wasn't long before she began hearing the whispers. At first, she thought it was just the wind, rustling through the branches. But no, this was different. It was as if something was speaking just out of her hearing range. The words were faint, barely perceptible, but they chilled her to the bone. She paused, straining her ears. "Come closer." The voice was soft, seductive, almost like a lullaby. It made her blood run cold. She stepped forward, unsure of why she was compelled to do so, but something about it pulled her in. "Hello," she called out, her voice shaky. The whisper stopped. She waited, holding her breath. Then, the whisper came again, this time clearer, closer. "Come closer, we're waiting." A knot of fear twisted in her stomach. She turned, her flashlight sweeping the darkened path behind her. The beam caught the silhouette of a figure standing just out of the light. A man? Or was it something else? She blinked, and the figure was gone. Her heart pounded in her chest. The whisper came once more, so near it sounded like it was coming from the trees themselves. "Come closer, Sarah." She didn't want to go any further. Yet, as if trapped in a trance, she took one step, then another. The moonlight flickered through the canopy above, casting strange, elongated shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. She could hear them now, not just in her ears but in her mind, a constant echo. "Come closer, we're waiting for you." The trees seemed to close in around her. She spun around, but the path was gone. In its place, only thick underbrush and twisted roots lay ahead. Panic set in. She tried to retrace her steps, but every direction she turned felt wrong, disorienting. The air felt heavy, thick with something she couldn't quite explain, something wrong. Her flashlight flickered, and she swung it wildly, trying to see through the dark. The light caught something on the ground, an old, weathered stone with strange carvings etched into its surface. She knelt down, her hands trembling as she ran her fingers over the symbols. They seemed familiar, but she couldn't place where from. "We're waiting, Sarah." The voice came from behind her this time. Sarah jerked her head around, but there was nothing, no one. Her breath came in shallow gasps. She stood up, stumbling backwards, trying to make her way back to the cabin. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more frantic. The wind picked up, whipping through the trees, but it sounded like the forest itself was speaking, its voice merging with the whispers, all calling her name. She broke into a sprint, her legs burning as she pushed through the underbrush, branches scratching at her skin. The light from the cabin was barely visible in the distance, but she kept running, heart hammering in her chest. It felt as if the shadows themselves were chasing her. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, she burst into the clearing around the cabin. Her friends were there, startled at her sudden appearance. They rushed to her side, asking if she was all right. But Sarah couldn't speak. Her mouth was dry, and her legs were shaking. She turned back to look at the woods, expecting to see nothing, but instead, the darkness between the trees seemed alive. There, just at the edge of the clearing, stood a shadowy figure. For a brief moment, she swore she saw it move. Then, just as quickly as it had appeared, it melted into the night. "Are you okay?" one of her friends asked, his voice filled with concern. Sarah nodded, but deep down, she knew something was terribly wrong. The forest was no longer a peaceful escape. It had become something else, something that watched, something that waited. She never spoke of what happened that night. But every time she found herself alone in the woods, the whispers returned, faint but insistent, calling her name from the shadows. "We're waiting, Sarah." And every time, she could feel the eyes of the trees on her, watching, waiting. Liam had always been a lover of the outdoors, an adventurer at heart. He had hiked through many trails in the nearby forest, always feeling a sense of peace in the depths of nature. The woods were his sanctuary, where he could clear his mind and escape the distractions of everyday life. This particular afternoon, the sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow through the dense canopy above. Liam set off on one of his favorite trails, eager to embrace the tranquility of the woods once again. The trees seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon, their thick trunks rising up from the forest floor, their branches twisting together like ancient fingers. It was a perfect afternoon for a hike, and Liam had been walking for over an hour, enjoying the serene quiet of the forest. The path had become more rugged, with the trail narrowing and the underbrush growing thicker, but he wasn't deterred. This was where he liked to go, where fewer people ventured. As he continued down the trail, he noticed something odd in the distance. Far beyond the trees, moving along the edge of the woods, a figure, tall and cloaked in black, walking slowly but steadily. At first, Liam thought nothing of it. Maybe it was another hiker who had taken an alternate path, or perhaps someone else enjoying the solitude of the forest. But the figure moved unnaturally. There was no clear movement of arms or legs. It almost seemed as if the figure was floating, gliding along the earth. The hood was pulled low, obscuring the person's face, but something about the way they moved, so smoothly, so deliberately, struck Liam as strange. Curiosity nudged him forward, and he called out, "Hey, you lost or something?" His voice echoed through the trees, but there was no response. The figure did not turn to face him. Instead, it simply continued along the edge of the woods, walking away from him at a slow, measured pace. Liam hesitated. Something felt wrong, but he couldn't quite place it. Still, he told himself it was nothing more than a person who was just a little odd. After all, the woods were vast, and it wasn't unusual for people to lose their way. He decided to follow. As he quickened his pace, the figure moved just ahead of him, as though it knew he was coming. No matter how fast Liam moved, no matter how much he pushed himself, he couldn't catch up. The figure remained always a few paces ahead, walking at a steady, unhurried pace. Liam's heart began to race. There was something about this pursuit that felt off, a deep sense of unease creeping up his spine. He called out again, more urgently this time. "Hey, are you okay? Do you need help?" But there was no answer, no acknowledgement. The figure simply moved forward, never once looking back. The woods had grown darker now, the shadows stretching long and heavy as the sun dipped lower. The eerie silence of the forest seemed to deepen, the distant rustling of leaves and the occasional chirp of a bird the only sounds breaking the stillness. Liam pushed through thick underbrush, trying to keep his eyes on the cloaked figure. Then, as if in a dream, the figure stopped. It was no longer gliding but standing still, perfectly motionless, just beyond a small clearing. Liam stood there, panting from the chase, his breath visible in the chill of the evening air. He paused, uncertainty settling in. There was no explanation for the strange way the figure had moved, nor the odd sense of dread that crawled up his neck. He called out once more, "Hey, what's going on? Are you?" Before he could finish, the figure turned. Slowly, deliberately, the figure rotated to face him. But as it did, something that had been lurking in the back of Liam's mind suddenly dawned on him. The figure had no face. Underneath the black hood was nothing but a hollow void, a darkness so complete that it seemed to swallow all light. There were no eyes, no mouth, not even the faintest hint of a face at all. Just a deep, endless blackness, like staring into an abyss. It was the kind of emptiness that gnawed at your soul, leaving you feeling like you were about to be consumed by it. Liam's body froze, his breath caught in his throat. He felt the weight of the void, pressing against him, suffocating him, but his limbs refused to move. He couldn't tear his eyes away from the hood. The figure stood still, unmoving, its presence like a black hole in the midst of the forest. The air around him seemed to thicken, the silence heavier, pressing down on his chest like a physical weight. Then, without a sound, the figure began to retreat, stepping back into the shadows of the trees. Liam felt a sudden surge of terror. His legs unlocked, and he stumbled back, his instincts screaming at him to run. But the figure did not chase him. It simply retreated, slowly disappearing into the darkened woods. With his heart pounding in his chest, Liam turned and bolted in the opposite direction. The path had become a blur, the trees closing in around him like walls, their branches reaching down like skeletal hands trying to grab him. His breath came in sharp gasps as he ran, the soft crunch of the underbrush beneath his feet almost deafening in the silence of the forest. He didn't stop until he reached the edge of the woods, where the lights of the nearest town blinked in the distance. Trembling, he looked over his shoulder, expecting to see the figure emerging from the trees. But there was nothing. The woods were empty, calm, as if nothing had happened. Liam didn't return to those woods for months. When he finally did, he stuck to the well-trodden paths, never venturing too far from the familiar trails. And though he tried to shake the image of the faceless figure from his mind, it lingered, always just beyond the edge of his thoughts, waiting. Every time he stepped into the woods, he couldn't help but wonder if that figure was still there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for him to return. Toby and his cousin Maya had always enjoyed the quiet solitude of the woods, finding peace in the crackling of a campfire and the whispers of the wind through the trees. The days were spent exploring new paths, collecting wild berries, and marveling at the towering oaks that seemed to stretch for miles. But that summer, they decided to venture deeper into the forest, away from the beaten paths, seeking the kind of isolation they hadn't experienced before. They set up camp in a small clearing, the air still warm from the afternoon sun. The forest around them was thick with shadows as the day began to fade, and the ground beneath them was soft, covered in layers of fallen leaves. The sound of their laughter echoed in the growing dusk as they made their preparations for the evening, setting up the tent, gathering firewood, and unpacking their supplies. Toby took charge of the campfire, coaxing the flames into life with practiced hands while Maya busied herself arranging their sleeping bags. As the fire crackled and snapped, its warm glow danced on the trees, casting eerie shadows that seemed to stretch and bend unnaturally. The two cousins sat around the fire, sharing stories and making plans for the hike they'd take the next day. The air grew colder as the night deepened, but the fire kept them warm, the flickering light providing a sense of comfort in the growing darkness. But just as they were settling in for the night, Toby noticed something out of the corner of his eye. At first, it was nothing more than a flicker in the distance, just beyond the edge of the firelight, where the woods grew thick and impenetrable. A pair of glowing eyes, faint but unmistakable. "Did you see that?" Toby asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Maya glanced over, squinting into the dark. "What? Where?" Toby pointed to the spot, his finger trembling slightly. There, just beyond the reach of the firelight, two pale dots shimmered in the darkness. Eyes. They blinked slowly, watching them from the shadows. "Maybe it's just an animal," Maya suggested, trying to reassure herself as much as him. Toby wasn't so sure. The eyes were too high, too still, like nothing he'd seen in the woods before. He wasn't familiar with any animals around here that had eyes that glowed like that. He leaned forward, squinting, but the moment he did, the eyes disappeared, vanishing into the thick trees as if they had never been there at all. Toby's heart rate picked up. "That's weird," he muttered under his breath, trying to laugh it off, but the unease gnawed at him. Maya didn't seem convinced, either. She stared into the darkness, her brow furrowed. "Maybe it's nothing," Probably just a reflection of the fire or something. But as the minutes passed, the eyes returned, now closer. Toby caught a glimpse of them again, shining brighter than before. It was as if they were moving, gliding through the forest, almost like a predator stalking its prey. "Okay, I'm starting to get freaked out," Maya said, her voice trembling. "That's not normal." Toby swallowed hard, trying to ignore the creeping fear tightening around his chest. "I'm going to check it out." He stood up, grabbing his flashlight from the ground. "Stay here," he said, though he wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe it was the desire to prove that whatever it was nothing more than a trick of the light. Or maybe it was the need to conquer the gnawing fear that had started to settle in his bones. Maya didn't argue, but she looked uneasy. "Be careful, Toby." Toby stepped away from the fire, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness ahead of him. The eyes, however, were no longer visible. The forest seemed to close in around him as he walked deeper, the trees towering above like silent sentinels. He felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise, an eerie stillness enveloping him. The woods, usually so alive with the sounds of nocturnal creatures, were now unnervingly silent. He stopped, shining the flashlight in a wide arc, but there was nothing, just the inky blackness of the forest. The air felt colder now, the silence almost oppressive. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw it again, those eyes, glowing faintly, peering at him from behind a thick cluster of bushes. His breath caught in his throat, and he instinctively took a step back. The eyes didn't move, didn't blink, just stared at him with an unblinking intensity that made his skin crawl. The chill in the air seemed to intensify, and Toby could feel the weight of something unseen pressing down on him. It was as if the eyes were not just watching, but waiting for him to make a move. He hesitated, unsure whether to advance or retreat. It was then that the eyes moved closer, sliding through the underbrush with an unnatural fluidity. Toby's heart pounded in his chest. There was no animal in the world that moved like that, no creature that could navigate the woods with such purpose and silence. In a split second, the figure stepped out from behind the trees, emerging into the beam of his flashlight. It wasn't a deer. It wasn't any animal Toby had ever seen. It was humanoid in shape, tall and shrouded in darkness. Its body was a blur, shifting and undulating, as if it were made of the very shadows themselves. The eyes, those glowing, unsettling eyes, were now fixated on him, burning bright like two cold stars in the blackness. Toby froze. Fear wrapped its icy fingers around his throat, and he felt his legs weaken, the flashlight trembling in his hand. The figure didn't speak, didn't move, but its gaze seemed to pierce right through him, digging into the very core of his being. There was something in those eyes. Something ancient, something that didn't belong. He could feel his heart pounding in his ears, and before he could react, the figure vanished. One moment it was there, standing in front of him, and the next, it melted into the shadows, leaving nothing but the whisper of wind through the trees. Toby stumbled back, his breath ragged as he turned to run. He didn't care about anything but getting back to the campfire. He sprinted through the trees, his mind racing. Every crack of a twig, every rustle in the bushes felt like a threat. His pulse thundered in his ears as he tore through the underbrush, desperate to escape whatever it was he had just encountered. When he finally burst into the clearing, gasping for air, Maya was standing near the fire, looking around anxiously. "Toby, what happened? What did you see?" Toby couldn't speak at first. His mouth was dry, his body trembling. He looked over his shoulder, expecting to see the figure emerging from the woods again. But there was nothing, only the firelight flickering weakly in the night. "Nothing. I don't know." Toby stammered, his voice shaking. "But it's not safe here, Maya. We need to leave." The campfire crackled and popped, but it couldn't ease the gnawing fear that had settled deep in Toby's gut. As they packed up hastily, Toby couldn't help but glance over his shoulder one last time, a lingering dread gnawing at him. That night, they left the woods behind, but the memory of those glowing eyes, the figure that seemed to move with the darkness itself, never left him. Every time Toby closed his eyes, he saw those eyes staring at him from the shadows, waiting for him to return. And deep down, he knew it was only a matter of time before they came back for him. It was supposed to be a routine trip, a simple weekend escape from the noise of city life. Jack and his younger sister, Emma, had always enjoyed camping in the woods near their family's cabin, a place they'd been visiting since childhood. They were both familiar with the trails, the streams, and the towering trees that bordered the wilderness. This time, they decided to take a new path, one that ventured deeper into the woods, away from the usual campsites. The evening started as any other. They set up camp near an old, forgotten clearing, surrounded by dense thickets and thick vines that hadn't seen much human traffic. The air was thick with the earthy smell of moss and leaves, and the forest was alive with the chirping of crickets and the occasional hoot of an owl. Emma set up the tent while Jack gathered firewood, joking about their parents' overprotectiveness and how they'd never let them venture so deep into the forest when they were younger. As the sun sank beneath the horizon, they sat by the fire, the warm glow of the flames illuminating their faces. The flames crackled as they roasted marshmallows and talked about old memories, the comforting ambience of the fire filling the space between them. But as the night deepened, something began to change. The usual sounds of the forest, crickets, rustling leaves, the occasional animal movement, suddenly stopped. The air grew thick, and an odd silence settled in, as if the entire forest was holding its breath. Emma, sitting across from Jack, shifted uneasily. "Do you hear that?" Jack looked at her, his brow furrowed. "What? That sound?" Emma replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's hollow, like there's a deep, empty space around us." Jack listened. At first, he thought it was just the wind, or the usual creaks of the forest settling in for the night. But no, the sound Emma was referring to wasn't natural. It was a low, almost imperceptible hum that seemed to resonate from the very ground beneath them, vibrating through the air. It was a sound so hollow, so empty, it felt like something ancient had just woken up from a long slumber, stretching its limbs and shaking the world around it. "Maybe it's just an animal," Jack said, but even as he spoke, the doubt began to creep into his voice. He'd been camping in these woods for years, and he had never experienced anything like this. The sound seemed to grow, wrapping itself around them, growing louder with every passing second. It felt like it was coming from all directions, reverberating through the trees, making the night feel colder, darker, more oppressive. Emma stood up suddenly, her face pale. "I don't like this," she muttered. "It's not right." Jack was about to respond when the sound changed, shifting from a hum to something else entirely. A series of low, rhythmic thumps. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible, but then it grew in intensity, echoing through the woods like the beating of a massive heart. Each thump felt like it was getting closer, shaking the ground beneath them with a low, hollow vibration that seemed to come from deep within the earth. Emma's eyes widened with fear. "Jack, what is that?" Jack didn't have an answer. The rhythmic thumps were now so loud that the air around them seemed to vibrate with them. His heart raced. There was no animal he knew that made sounds like that, no creature that could produce such a deep, unsettling rhythm. It was unnatural. "Let's get inside the tent," Jack said, his voice tight with anxiety. Emma nodded without question, her hands trembling as she hurried toward the tent. Jack followed close behind, but as he turned to pull the flap open, something caught his eye. A shadow. Not from the trees or the flickering firelight, but something darker, deeper, that seemed to move on its own. It was as if the very air had darkened, creating a shape that was not part of the natural world. The shadow was tall, long, its edges flickering like smoke in the wind. It hovered at the edge of the clearing, just at the edge of the firelight, its outline shifting, constantly changing, as if it were made of the very darkness that surrounded it. The thumping sound grew louder, closer now. Each beat seemed to shake the trees, making the branches creak as if they were about to snap under the pressure. Jack's breath caught in his throat, and he pulled Emma into the tent with him, fumbling with the zipper as the sound outside became almost unbearable. The tent seemed too thin, too fragile, as if it could be ripped apart at any moment. The rhythmic thumping now felt like it was directly outside, vibrating through the very ground they were lying on. Jack could feel the tent tremble with every pulse. And then, the silence came. The thumping stopped as abruptly as it had started, leaving only the hollow hum, which now seemed to echo in the space around them. The forest was deathly quiet. The air felt still, too still. Jack didn't dare to move. His mind was racing. Had the creature, whatever it was, left? Or was it simply waiting, watching them from the shadows, its invisible eyes on them, just beyond their reach? Suddenly, a noise broke the stillness. A low whisper, soft but unmistakable. A voice, distant, almost like it was coming from deep within the earth itself, curling around them like tendrils of smoke. Leave or stay forever. Jack's blood ran cold. The voice was deep, resonant, almost otherworldly. It wasn't human, that much was certain. The very earth seemed to speak with an ancient, terrifying power that seeped into his bones. Emma clutched his arm, her eyes wide with terror. "Jack, do you think it's real?" The whisper came again, louder this time, closer, as though the earth itself was closing in around them. "Leave now, or you will remain in the hollow forever." Jack's hand shook as he fumbled for the flashlight in his pack. He shone the beam around the tent, but there was nothing. The light flickered. Nothing moved. Yet, the presence outside was palpable, thick like a weight pressing down on the very air. Without a word, Jack grabbed Emma's hand. They bolted from the tent, the cold air biting at their skin as they ran through the darkened woods, the eerie hum still echoing in their minds. They didn't look back as they reached the edge of the clearing, where the sound finally stopped. When they made it back to the cabin, the sun had just begun to rise, casting long shadows across the forest. The woods were still, silent, almost too quiet. They never spoke of that night again, but neither of them ever returned to that particular spot in the woods. And for the rest of their lives, whenever they heard a deep, hollow sound, whether from a creaking floorboard or an ancient tree, the memory would return, and with it, the whisper, "Leave now, or you will remain in the hollow forever." Jack and Emma knew one thing for sure. The forest had its secrets, and some were better left untouched.